everybody to my little series that I have going on. My own personal little dedicated series. The first, I could say, that I've created. And like for the next few minutes, I'm just going to be posing the character and maybe some minor weight painting, like around his wrist area when it bends. Like when I bent the hand and bent the arm, the entire wrist bent outward, like it was. You'll see it in a moment. It's a bad kind of deform, one that you don't want, and one that you will want to spend the effort to try and fix. Otherwise, it will just look horrible, and it looks like maybe he's broken his arm or his wrist, and it's just like he's just going with it, you know. You can easily fix this. Yeah, see right there, that's what I was talking about. That's a very unusual bend. You can easily fix that by adjusting the influence of each of the bones. The problem there is there's lack of influence around that bone. Now, I thought before it was because I lacked a bone in the wrist area, but I learned that day that it was just because there wasn't enough influence around that bone. And I had spent like in one of my past, in fact it was my last model before this one, that I experienced the same problem, but with fingers. I experienced that exact same problematic bend that I did, but with like all of the fingers in that one model. And what I had to do for that model was I had to delete the parent. I eventually figured out that I had to delete the parent altogether because I was trying to parent with empty groups. And I deleted the parent finally and set the parent to automatic. In a moment, I'm going to fix the weight problem, and I'll just finish the process of the modeling. Well, the posing anyway. I still have plenty of modeling. I'm going to bring in a hat, a coat, and a cane, and it's extremely simple. I'm gonna actually speed it up.
Honestly, try honesty, no. Just tell me what I want to hear, 'cause it could save us. Let me fly, I've got my hopes, but I can hardly see why I'm still chasing. It's not worth it for me anymore. Crashed and burned 100 times, I'm lost. I just can't let this go. Every last chance I had is gone, but I just can't let you know. I just can't let you just can't let you know.
There we go. Now it's going a bit faster. Making clothes is very easy. A friend of mine, whose name is Dylan Hatcher, he's also a 3D artist. When it came to making clothes, I was telling him about how I wanted to make the clothes separate from the model. It would be like a way of dressing the model, and that's a much tedier process, and it definitely requires a lot more work. So if you're going to do that, you at least want to be careful. You don't want to be lazy about anything, otherwise you will encounter clipping where it is least convenient. Uh, and he told me about that he basically recommended that I keep the clothes separate, not separate, that I model the clothes directly onto the model itself, and I don't like that idea. I like it's basically me practicing for animation when I'm making the clothes separate from the model, and what I do is I go to edit mode and I basically duplicate de- depending on what uh, c- clothing that I'm creating. In this case, in a moment, I'm going to be creating a coat. I'm just going to select a certain amount of vertices and I'm going to duplicate them and resize them a little bit. And there's definitely a lot of work to be done. Now you can also, since I will be duplicating those vertices, they will actually retain the modifiers. And if you notice in the modifiers panel, there's actually an armature modifier, and that basically just bounds the model to an armature. And likewise, it did the same thing with the vertices that I duplicated, so instead of having to spend the strenuous effort to try and line the clothing up with the model, I didn't have to do that at all, because it was already attached to the armature, so it already, bent in place and followed the model. Now, it wasn't perfect, because when I went to adjust the the uh, the clothing, there was a lot of clipping, so it's not a perfect method, but it requires a lot of refinement. But it it works, I guess. It would be better if it was a cloth simulation, because then it's going to simulate an interaction with the model, as long as, like, there's a tutorial on it that I watched, and I'm saying all that because that is where I learned it from. I'll try and find it. And basically, you add collision physics and you simulate a cloth simulation, and you can adjust how tight the clothes are or how well it interacts with the model, and it's really cool, and it's quite realistic compared to how I've seen other models, I guess. I would say that it would look more realistic than simply modeling the clothes onto the character, because, you know, in real life, your clothes aren't a part of you. They're like, I don't think I need to explain that for logical reasons. So why would you do the same for a model, other than for the sake of simplicity? Of course, you can sculpt the clothing to look like actual clothing, but it's I'm crazy about accuracy. But then again, this isn't being used for animation, so since you don't actually need to simulate anything, you can pretty much just fake it, you could say, and that's not a bad thing. That's just easier, because a cloth simulation is for animation, and if you can work with it without if you're not animating, you don't need to use it. So if you can basically bend it to your will, so to speak, then just do that, And that's definitely the reason why my friend recommended that. I, however, chose to do otherwise. Now, since this in particular is a coat, I would not be painting it, so I could use the solidify modifier. I don't remember if I did, but I could use it for that particular thickness. So, I think I will just speed it up from here because pretty much it's all about modeling his coat and fixing any clipping. So, yeah. Right, so now we have moved on to the simple process of creating some, well, I've moved on to the simple process of creating some glasses. It's really simple, and it was actually kind of different for me because I've never made this many props in 3D art until this particular model. I had never made a cane, a top hat, or glasses. I mean, it's easy, but like, there's a first time for everything, and this was my first time for a couple of things. Even making this series of voiceover clips rather than speeding the entire thing up as you watch it unfold into the madness that it is. So, I actually apply 3 materials to this particular object, you could say. I I had like a base, a base material, which will be black, and then the little supports, which will be brown, kind of like a darkish brown, supports that nobody will ever see, but are there anyway, because, the extra effort to make it more realistic. And then the lens. And this is all accomplished. You can apply all of these materials to different parts of the object just by doing pretty much the same thing you do with vertex groups. You select certain vertices, and then you click assign in the materials tab, and then it'll assign that material to those specific vertices. So that makes creating glasses that much easier. In this particular segment, I'm just trying to figure out how I'm going to make these glasses fit onto this otter's head, this odd-shaped head. And the problem was, I tried using ordinary glasses, and ordinary glasses might work for an ordinary individual, or should I say a human being, but as you can see, they do not work that well with something not human. So I decided to go originally and make my own, and it looked actually quite cool. And yeah, it's gonna be one of the smaller details that people won't really notice unless you make the face the focal point, but it's still a fun part of the model to do, because making anything new is normally pretty fun if you know what you're doing. And as long as you're paying attention, like if you're trying to make it accurate and you're making a ref, or if you're just creating something new, that's always the joy of it. And that's what matters, is that you enjoy what you do, and maybe you could push it as far as to make it a living. Do it for a living. And see, I couldn't merge all of those faces because it wasn't uniform. So what I did was I hit Control M, and you'll get a little pop-up box. It'll ask you where you want to merge at. You want to merge it either the center, or collapse the edges to the center, or merge them all at the center. And what I did was I collapsed it to the center because you could merge it around a 3D cursor for a little bit more accuracy, but I felt too lazy at that time, and it did exactly what I wanted. So then I selected those single faces, and I created a glass material, and I applied it to those two vertices, and you can see that he can also see now. And yeah, that's very clear and just a super freaking quick way to make glass. Now there are people who actually go into the node editor and make a bunch of different effects for the glass, or like do different kinds of nodes, and I guess that's like for the just to make it more realistic. When you go, typically when somebody's going into the node editor to work on a material, that's to make it reflect more realistically, because you can't, even inside the just the materials alone, there are so, like, in the materials you can't make it, like in the materials tab, you can't make it 100% realistic. So you will have to go to the node editor, and that's because the node editor has so many nodes that do different things, from glares to reflections to how the light actually bounces off the object and how the object absorbs the same light. It's just a lot, and that's what's, I guess you could say, that's what's amazing. Because you have so many possibilities, and depending on how you do this is what pretty much defines your art style. Right now I'm doing it pretty simplistic. Let me rephrase that. Right now I'm doing it pretty simply. My excuse is that my very bad excuse is that I'm waiting for a better computer for the greater detail of modeling, and it's a bad excuse considering what I have presented here, but it's really a hassle. Like, if you're like using my computer and you subdivide a model a certain amount of times, like my computer has a legitimate limit, or at least Blender in my computer has a limit. It regardless if I'm using the multi-resolution or the subdivision surface, I cannot subdivide my model any higher than 3. Like, I can set the settings and it will subdivide inside the 3D view, and I could work with that, but it will lag the system a little bit, but it will not be able to render the model at like 4 with the settings set to 4, regardless if it's the subdivision surface or the multi-resolution. It just won't. Maybe if I boost the RAM by using a program I have, it might work, but sometimes I use a particle system as well, and That's just a lot for your system if you're going to put it through that much. Now, if your system can handle it, then yeah, go for it. Like Blender's recommended specs are, well, no, their optimal specs is like 16 gigabytes of RAM plus some other specs that I cannot remember at that time. And then the recommended is 8 gigabytes of RAM. Of course, your graphics card plays the probably the biggest role when it comes to rendering, because that's pretty much the PowerPoint. I unfortunately do not have a graphics card or a graphics computing unit, or yeah, that's what it's called. The best I have is a one. I showed it in the beginning. 666 gigahertz CPU, and I have done so much with just this little bit, and I'm so eager to work with a new computer just for the endless possibilities of what I could create. Like the computer I have in mind, it comes with 16 gigabytes, or at least I think it does. There's a newer model of it, and it's upgradable to 32 gigabytes, and that's pretty much my prize right now. That's like, if there was an idealistic life goal in life, it would be to get that computer, so I could create amazing things and never have to worry about a single bit of lag again. It's a gaming computer, so it's going to have a lot of power, and it's got like this really nicely dedicated cooling system. It's big, it's got a CD player, and you can't really find computers with such high amount of power with a CD player unless it's a gaming PC. So that's a thing. I am actually almost done here. I'm gonna be pretty soon going into detail on rendering, but I could just go ahead and talk about that. Every single phase of the process is important. Like, I am not exaggerating when I say every phase. From the modeling, to the sculpting, to the painting, to the posing, to the rendering. Rendering is just as important because you want to have a decent... Oh, I'm also using a particle system, an extremely simple particle system, using a vertex group that will... that I used for an exclusion. I think I made another one anyway, and used that one for the density rather than the exclusion. But I think I used the particle system exclusion vertex group instead, which is just what I named a vertex group. There's not a particular vertex group type that's named like that. I had to use the verts option so that way it would stick to the group that I made, because volume wasn't working. So, and anyway, well, I guess I could continue elaborating on a particle system. It's extremely easy. You create a new particle system, and make sure, if you want hair, you want to set it to hair, right? Because what emitter does is it basically shoots out particles from a specific object, and depending on if you have a vertex group set up, then it's going to shoot out objects from a specific area. There's tutorials out there on it, but basically, like, you could just, like, it gets involved with force fields, I think, and gravity, and all those kinds of adjustments. I have not gotten that far. I just use the particle system for fur at the moment. So I would recommend going and if you want to learn more about that, then you should go look it up. And now I'm getting into the rendering process. Now, you can adjust the dimensions of your camera, but remember, that's going to increase the render time significantly by adding way more squares. The higher the resolution of your image, the longer it will take, and the smaller the squares get. And when you're using cycles, you will encounter what we call noise, and what people identify as fireflies, which is basically really bright pixels. And remember to set the file type for your render, so that way it saves to the correct type. You're not wanting to render an animation of a still pose. And it's also important to adjust the sample size. There's a dedicated sampling menu in the render tab. You want to adjust the one for render. The one for the preview is basically when you go to rendered view instead of rendering the whole image. And if you select your camera when you go to rendered preview, it will actually show you what it looks like inside the camera, how everything looks inside the camera, and it's really convenient if you want to make some fine adjustments. And another important value to set, since you're going to experience noise, you're going to want to adjust the clamping value. And this is something I learned from Andrew Price when he was talking about photorealism.